I think we get going, and welcome everybody to the new series of seminars. We're quite excited about this series. I think it's going to be good, again, as it usually is. And yeah, before we do start as well, just to do the acknowledgement for country, we are on here in UWA, at least, we're on the Whadjuk Noongar people's land, and we pay our respects to their elders, past and present. Yeah, maybe I'll just give Richard time. He's our new discipline chair, and he just has a few words to speak as well.
Thank you very much. First of all, just to say thank you very much to Dorinda, Valentina and Cheryl for putting together this seminar series for this semester. It's a fantastic, really rich seminar series, and it's delighted to see a really good mix of postgrads with faculty members and a number of our adjuncts and so on speaking as well. So thank you very much indeed for putting together a very rich program, and we're very much looking forward to it. I've got a few notices just to very briefly highlight before we get into today's talk. Firstly, to say we've revitalized the Facebook page, so Anthropology and Sociology at UWA, as a discipline group page, as an outlet for advertising things that are going on, but also to highlight the successes of our discipline group members. So especially the PhD students, if there's anything you'd like us to put on that to sort of advertise to the wider world, then please do. Publications, prizes, events that you're taking part in, anything really that that will be good to draw attention and publicity for yourselves and for the discipline group as a whole. Within that, just a few things to highlight. Our colleague Glenn Savage is this is on the Facebook page, so you can find more details there if I can hold it. Is speaking at an online event organised between UWA and University of Manchester called Doing Critical Education Policy Research. So that's on Wednesday, March the 24th. It's got a really innovative format of one picture and 1,000 words. So that looks really exciting. So we look forward to Glenn's contribution to that. We've also got a further seminar series running at the moment, which I'm convening with Christina Rocha at University of Western Sydney. This is a Zoom seminar series called Religion, Crisis and Disaster. And we got off to a flyer on Wednesday, this past Wednesday, with Professor Birgit Meyer, who's Head of Anthropology at University of Amsterdam. And then next week we've got Simon Coleman, the great anthropologist of religion, who's now at Toronto. So again, please do join us for that online seminar series. And that's enough online. Offline, we have the Ethnographic film series. So this has been happening informally for some time, but we've formalized it this year. So it's going to be on Tuesdays, at least for the first part of the semester. It will be on Tuesdays, 5 o'clock in the Austin Lecture Theatre. And we've got quite a rich program of ethnographic films. Always much nicer to watch them on the big screen with the full cinema experience rather than watching things on the small screen. Fantastic. Does anyone else have any notices or? Great. Thank you very much indeed, and look forward to today's talk.
Okay, thank you, Richard.
Talk.
Thank you. So today we do have 3 presenters. I might just introduce them separately as we go along. So the first one will be Tammy Jonas. She is actually in Victoria, I believe. So that's why we had to do this presentation on Zoom. And she'll be speaking to us on raising rare breed livestock, a counter-hegemonic project towards an agroecological transition in Australia. Sounds interesting, Tammy. All over to you.
Thank you. I'll just let the farm truck drive by before I start so it doesn't interrupt everyone. It's really nice to be here with you all, even online. I don't know when I'll get to be over in WA and meet some of you in person. It might be a while, so I'll get used to you all this way. And I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the lands of Dja Dja Wurrung country, the Djara people, which have been unceded, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also my respects to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders here today. The development of agriculture over the past 12,000 years resulted in what James Scott argues is a contraction of our species' attention to and practical knowledge of the natural world, a contraction of diet, a contraction of space, and perhaps a contraction as well in the breadth of ritual life. As a farmer myself, I find this a rather alarming take on my livelihood, and I'm hoping for some change in future, and that's sort of what this project is about. Much later, as we know, monotheistic religions grew on the foundational discourses of human dominion over nature, contributing to the move from more ecologically sensitive traditional farming practices to the highly mechanized practices we have today of capitalist industrialized agriculture. This latter form of agriculture has systematized human mastery over nature, and that's had pretty devastating consequences, including what we're now seeing as the sixth major extinction event in 4.6 billion years. Jumping to 2019, the UN reported that many key components for biodiversity for food and agriculture at genetic, species, and ecosystem levels are in decline. And the evidence suggests that the proportion of livestock breeds specifically at risk of extinction is increasing. In Australia, as elsewhere, the rise of fast-growing, high-yielding industrial breeds or industrial genetics has led to a concurrent loss of rare and heritage breed livestock. So while there is a move to preserve heritage breeds led by the Rare Breeds Trust of Australia, it's quite nascent and unsupported by government policy. In fact, in Australia, there's a notable lack of research around the importance of biodiversity in agriculture. And an example of this is the recent initiative, the Australian Farm Biodiversity Certification Scheme trial, which was funded by the federal government and run by the National Farmers Federation, demonstrated very clearly how far we have to go in understanding what we need to do in terms of biodiversity in agriculture, because the scheme, in fact, doesn't seek to measure biodiversity in agriculture at all. It's seeking to measure biodiversity sort of around agriculture, like there's a buffer zone where we grow things and out there is where biodiversity happens. So we're measuring the loss of biodiversity broadly, but not the biodiversity in the food we grow and eat. And also, really importantly, we're not measuring it very often in the soils, which we now understand are fundamental to everything. And in fact, last night at midnight, I was in UN meetings of the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the major report that's just come out is the state of knowledge of soil biodiversity. And Australia puts in something about the Soils for Life initiative and trumpets it as our excellent work on soil biodiversity, when most of that has been largely ignored by industrial agriculture in this country. Not entirely, there's happier things to report, but this isn't the time for it. One happy thing to report is that this PhD is part of a larger project funded by a DECA grant entitled Raising Rare Breeds, Domestication, Extinction and Meat in the Anthropocene, led by the wonderful Katie Grecia, aka Fred, here today, which aims to address this dearth of research through developing greater understandings of rare and heritage breed farming across Australia. My own involvement in this broader project around rare breeds is born of my life as a former vegetarian tree-hugging greenie to my life as a pig farming butcher tree-hugging greenie. My husband and I farm here on the volcanic soils of Dja Dja Wurrung country, and we moved here motivated by a desire to help grow the movement of ethical and ecologically sound livestock farmers in Australia. We were inspired by the biodiverse values of the rare breeds movement, but we were really compelled by our ethics around how animals are raised for food. And so coming here with those sort of values and motivations, we were somewhat surprised, I guess, by the full complexity of ecological, social, and political entanglements that this path would actually reveal to us, which ultimately leads me to this talk right now. Every moment in my life got me here. While you've probably all heard of regenerative agriculture, agroecology is much less known or understood. So agroecology is considered a science, a set of practices, and a social movement. And it's fundamental to the core of this project, including its attention to the role of animals in agroecosystems, the importance of biodiversity, and also the socialities of agroecological farmers. Broadly speaking, agroecology is a scientifically and experientially justified practice of agriculture in ways that are sensitive to the ecosystems in which it is situated and that fosters the democratic participation of farmers in the food system. And that last point I think is really important about the distinction when we think about regenerative agriculture or agroecology. Agroecology is at its core about democratic participation in the food system. And I don't think regen ag necessarily has that built in, though there are many who are advocating under the banner of regen ag. Now, while non-Indigenous farmers who identify as regenerative or agroecological promote their or our innovations on social media, at conferences, during farmer field days, Altieri and Holt Jimenez remind us that the true roots of agroecology lie in the ecological rationale of Indigenous and peasant agriculture still prevalent across the world. And the UN provides evidence that globally, Indigenous peoples and local communities are the best custodians of biodiversity, emphasizing the need to look to Indigenous knowledges and to respect the customary laws and sovereignty of Australia's First Peoples. Now, I should just say, while the UN acknowledges this in multiple reports, they never acknowledge this in their action plans. And that was one of the points we were making in last night's meetings, that you have to stop acknowledging in reports with no action that Indigenous people and peasants are the original and best custodians of biodiversity and never put that in your action plans. As we here at Jonai Farms have deepened our experience and knowledge of Dja Dja Wurrung country in our relatively short time as custodians, we've also come to better understand the compelling need to decolonize ourselves and to affirm solidarity with First Peoples in order to grow a future for Australia that is ecologically sustainable and sustainably just, not just for us, but for everyone. Indigenous Knowledge's scholar Tyson Yunkaporta of the Appalachian Clan of Far North Queensland asserts, "We rarely see global sustainability issues addressed using Indigenous perspectives and knowledges. It's always about the what and never about the how." So I'm pretty interested in Yunkaporta's how, and this project aims to examine the ways in which Australia's new peasantry, and I'll come back to that in a moment, can be informed by Indigenous epistemologies and ontologies to combat and adapt to climate change. I ask, how can small-scale farmers inhabit and care for land in such a way as to maintain healthy agroecosystems and their human and non-human communities while advancing Indigenous peoples' sovereignty? What are the discrepancies and what convergences in Indigenous and non-Indigenous epistemologies is needed and indeed possible? I aim to contribute to the movement of small-scale non-Indigenous farmers as we come to terms with our colonial privilege through a process of critical self-reflection alongside public political ally work, supporting Indigenous struggles, and to actively promote the ecologically sustainable and socially just work that I find. And I just want to very quickly explain my use of the word peasant in Australia, a country which has no history of a peasantry. The 2018 UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and Other People Working in Rural Areas defines a peasant in a way that we consider includes smallholders here in Australia as well. It's any person who engages or seeks to engage alone or in association with others or as a community in small-scale agricultural production for subsistence and or for the market, and who relies significantly, though not necessarily exclusively, on family or household labor and other non-monetized ways of organizing labor, and who has a special dependency on an attachment to the land. So we would assert that the smallholders in this country are also rights holders under the declaration. The term, though, as you can imagine, is still problematic in the public-facing space. So we're working on how to socialize the Australian public to calling us peasants. That's probably a subject of another paper. Given my position here as a farmer activist scholar deeply embedded in these communities of interest in the project, I plan to undertake multi-sided ethnography as an insider anthropologist. The fieldwork with farmers will be guided by the following broad questions. Why do farmers choose rare and heritage breeds of livestock? How are these farmers fostering biodiversity and multi-species flourishings? How and where are these farmers accessing agroecological knowledge and experience? Why and how are farmers engaging with local Aboriginal people and their ecological knowledge? And do they engage with the local Jara people or with others outside our bioregion? Are they doing this directly or indirectly? And why for these different ways? What are the constraints and enablers of agroecological farming with rare and heritage breeds? And by this, I mean the genetic, technical, legislative, economic, social, and ecological constraints and enablers. I'll choose 3 farms here in the Central Highlands for participant observation based on criteria that they grow rare breed cattle and or pigs for the commercial sale of meat and or dairy, and that they sell their produce through direct channels. And that speaks to a distinction made by Van der Plague about peasant versus entrepreneurial agriculture and the means of access to market being an important part of trying to understand the motivations and values of the different sorts of maybe peasant farmers. In addition to participant observation, I'll do semi-structured interviews designed to elucidate data ranging from the values and paradigms that shape the farmer's actions through the everyday practices of rearing heritage breed livestock to farmers' relationships with other farmers, those who buy their produce, local Aboriginal peoples, and also the state. Questions will also focus on the extent to which the farmers are collectivized. Are they associated with agroecology and food sovereignty as a social movement? Do they belong to any local, regional, or national organizations? And if so, to what end? Observations of land and water use and health, animal husbandry practices, and perceptions of animal welfare will help achieve the aims of the project. Focus group discussions with more farmers of rare and heritage breeds within and outside my region will also be held online and in person, I hope. I am in Victoria after all, with some questions adapted from the semi-structured interviews with my key participant farmers. Drawing on work recounted in chambers on reality mapping and ecological mapping undertaken with farmers in the global south, farmers in focus groups will be asked to draw a political biocultural map, as I'm calling it, of their farms to gain insights into their perspectives on the ecological, social, and political contexts in which they farm. One of the key questions that orients my research is revealing the experience of other heritage breed livestock farmers. What's the relationship between a focus on breed conservation and an awareness of the importance of greater biodiversity at all levels of food and agriculture systems? By examining the grounded practices, decision-making processes, and stated values of farmers who raise rare and heritage breed livestock, exotic, non-industrial, counter-hegemonic animals, as I think of them, this project seeks to uncover the paradigms farmers bring to their work. What underpins the decision to raise slow-growing, low-yielding animals to earn a livelihood? Does the choice to raise rare and heritage breeds sit alongside other values and practices that support more multi-species flourishings, as Haraway would say? I aim to be a lot more practical than Haraway, though I'm just going to say that. A guiding theme will be to ask how farmers are responding to the burden of responsibility carried by the human condition of living with and for others, as Bird has said, as they negotiate entanglements with country and human and non-human animals. Yunka Porter also asserts the importance of Aboriginal social structures in achieving sensitive community and land management, describing his clan as autonomous individuals syndicated together in a collective. With this framing in mind, I seek to understand the importance of existing connections amongst autonomous small-scale farmers that contribute to cultural and ecological reparations and social organization, and to learn what collaborative and deliberate practices they engage in to diversify breeds and grasses and crops within the region, and to advocate for agroecology-friendly policies. I further aim to identify pathways towards a place-based co-management of Aboriginal lands so damaged by colonial mining and agriculture here that the Dja people call it upside-down country. My project is in part a response to the UN's critical assessment of biodiversity loss and its recommendations, which identified the need to conserve breeds, as well as the need for multidisciplinary research to understand the role of greater biodiversity in agriculture more broadly. It's also a continuation of a lifetime concern about the treatment of animals in agriculture and a long history of food sovereignty activism that ultimately led me to where I now farm with Stuart, and a like-minded community that has glimmers of Yunka Porter's autonomous individuals syndicated together in a collective. Ultimately, my project aims to identify the ecological, social, and political factors that contribute to the successful practice of agroecology in Australia. My specific focus is on the practice of raising rare and heritage breed pigs and cattle in agroecosystems and the work being done by small-scale farmers to decolonize agriculture with what I propose are counter-hegemonic breeds. Using insider activist anthropology to work with a selection of farmers in Dja Dja Wurrung country, I aim to understand the values, epistemologies, and politics that lead farmers to choose these livestock to farm agroecologically. And finally, acknowledging that small-scale farmers operate within certain norms and rules of the state, which have a material impact on their autonomous capacity to farm in ecologically sustainable and socially just ways. I aim to understand and make visible existing state and suprastate instruments and processes that currently constrain farmers' activities and those that can enable agroecology and rare breed farming in Australia. In the face of the massive global loss of agricultural biodiversity over many decades, I hope this research can provide critical information and recommendations to slow and address losses and to support increases in biodiversity in farming. I'll engage with local smallholder and Indigenous knowledges and practices on Dja Dja Wurrung country to uncover the diverse stories of Indigenous and non-Indigenous custodians of country. The significance lies in actively working to uncover, support, and promote the biodiverse and decolonising practices of agroecological farmers of rare and heritage breed livestock, to serve the urgent need to value and protect biodiversity in food and agriculture systems in the face of multiple threats from climate change and the emergence of pandemics such as COVID-19. The project is part of and manifests the values of the social movement for food sovereignty and agroecology. In addition to my life as a farmer, I've been president of the Australian Food Sovereignty Alliance for far too long, which is actively working across all 6 domains of transformation to an agroecological future identified by Anderson et al. The domains include access to natural ecosystems, knowledge and culture, systems of exchange, networks, equity, and discourse. And this project will hopefully contribute to AFSA's and the broader food sovereignty movement's work for agroecology, access to land, understanding the role of farming on other people's land when you're non-Indigenous, a huge range of AFSA's activities that I won't list. So in following the deeply embedded stories, practices, soils, plants, human and non-human animals, and microbes on agroecological farms, working to preserve rare and heritage breed livestock, as well as the rather more abstract yet also quite specific stories and practices of the state. This project will assert an ontological politics, a politics of materiality and not just representation of what is, what should, and what might be realized. Thanks.
Thank you, Tammy. That was lovely. I will now open the floor for questions. They have changed the raise your hand button, but I would like you to use it because I have more than one screen. So if you wave, I won't see you. So if you go to reactions now, you've got the raise hand option there, and then I'll be able to clearly see that you want to ask a question. So we have a few minutes for questions.
Great.
Who would like to go first? Loretta.
Thanks, Tammy. I really enjoyed that. Normally I would reserve this for a coffee chat, really, because I'm a newcomer to your field and learning so much from these presentations that Katie's bringing to the discipline group. I just wanted to comment on your discussion of peasants and how, you know, many migrants come from peasant backgrounds into Australia and bring that knowledge, especially historically, right, in terms of agriculture. And I just was very interesting that the migration process kind of makes them not peasants somehow in our imaginings. But yeah, anyway, it's just a comment. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, I think the inquiry line around peasantry is going to be really interesting in a country like Australia that has such a multicultural population of farmers and non-farmers. And I mean, I myself would consider myself the daughter of a peasant from Alabama, to be honest. So, you know, he was picking cotton in the fields for 25 cents a day when he was a kid. And yet, as a white American Australian, I'd be loath to start with that as an introduction. So, yeah.
I mean, the other side of that, of course, is, I mean, my heritage is Italian migrant, right? So my great-great-grandfather came out the turn of the last century, and I mean, they were big tree clearers in the forests of the southwest of WA. And, you know, I have a colleague from Sardinia who worked in our agriculture department here at UWA and then worked for CSIRO, and he would always say, you know, don't eat the fruit from the Italian migrant properties. They're really big on poison. So there's such a mix of issues about peasantry. I think it just raised those issues for me. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Martin, would you like to ask your question? You're on mute.
Unmute.
There we go.
So, firstly, echoing Loretta's commentary about the presentation, it was wonderfully lucid and some really interesting ideas, Tammy. Thank you so much. I just want to draw out, I think I heard you suggest that Indigenous people are the better custodians of the land. I think you used that phrase. And I'd just like to hear more about that in a contemporary context, of course, in the sense of when we think about the needs that are needing to be met and all of the kind of competing needs and so on. But when we're talking about agricultural practice, I'm interested in that comment and just in teasing out what that actually looks like as a practice.
Yeah, I think it's going to be, Martin, I think it's going to be one of those tricky areas to navigate, actually, because I'm very conscious that, you know, hashtag not all Indigenous practices are ecologically sensitive. So, so I think without having some good, you know, field work on the ground to talk about the practices, I don't want to speak in generalities, but I've spent the better part of the last decade with Indigenous comrades all over the world who are certainly engaged in what I would consider very ecologically sensitive farming practices in their countries. And I also think that the flourishing of interest in Indigenous management of this landscape pre-colonization is showing that there's a much better way to be with country than what came after 1788. And yet that's not to again suggest in a general way that all of it will have been. So I think I need to spend time with the specificities to understand that better. But I'm really fortunate in the international food sovereignty movement to have also spent time with Indigenous people from Peru and Bolivia, and them talking about the ways that they are with their country and the country as their mother, and their abhorrence at even the phrase natural resources, because they think that's a terrible way to talk about your mother. And that actually the idea of separating yourself from nature is why people from countries like ours behave so poorly about land. But again, I think the importance to this work to go deeply into any of the truth of this matter will be in local examples from fieldwork.
Thank you. Martin, you happy with that? Is there some...
No, ask if you're not.
Well, happy is probably not the adjective I'd go for in all of that, but yeah, look, I think there's a really fascinating debate. I suppose, Tammy, that if I was to push at that a bit further, it's to say, okay, so if we think about a pre-contact, a pre-colonial, pre-invasion, all of those phrases, production as opposed to a now, you know, where surplus is still a requirement. I mean, food security is required. I just wonder about how that then plays itself out, how we marry maybe is the different practices.
I think, again, that's going to be a really interesting, really interesting line to follow, because the very notion of surplus takes me to my, you know, interesting critiques of capitalism and how much surplus do we really need, right? So I think if you take the peasant's notion of surplus, just enough to get through the next season, as opposed to enough to sell to everyone else overseas, we probably... Well,
I suppose I'm thinking national food security. I'm thinking of 20 million people.
Yeah.
As an example, yeah.
Well, I mean, we export 70% of what we produce, so
sure. Yeah.
We're a bit more than food secure, aren't we?
Maybe you're going to have to get more answers, you know, in a few years' time when she presents again. Yeah.
But any more of those hard questions, you've got my email somewhere probably, so I'm up for it. I want to know what I need to answer.
Yeah. Okay, so how about we leave it there? I don't see any more hands raised, and we do have 2 more presenters still. Thank you very much again, Tammy. Maybe we should all give her a clap. You have the reactions button there. Thank you.